feel like Gordon Bombay would have taken his career to even further heights.
Everything's flashy, everything's cocaine, everything's
Fun.
Open wide for some soccer.
I don't care what you think about what your personal thoughts are at home. I care that you hate the Cowboys.
Call this college rule.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Sports Experience Podcast. Chris and Dom here for another episode. And before we begin, we're just a couple of local Tucson comics recording here at Engle Studio, which is here for all of your audio needs. And if you do us a big favor, if you like what you're listening to, hit that subscribe button, like us on all our socials. And Chris, we have a very special episode today.
That's right. We got a special episode and a special guest.
We do indeed.
Why
Why don't you introduce yourself, Elias?
I am Elias, a part-time pseudo Tucson comic and boxing aficionado, and James Toney super fan.
Yes, and I did want to bring up all of the boxing episodes that we do come out with. This is the guy behind them pitching us suggestions. So if you like the Ibiabuchi or the Galata or the Riddick Bowe episodes, this is the man to thank. So, and today, because he is such a big James Toney fan, we are going to have our James Toney episode. So jump right in, Chris.
Yeah. Born, August 24th, 68 in Ann Arbor. Moved to Detroit when he was about 3, and then something happened.
Well, something kind of happens in between with his
That's right.
mom and
Something
dad.
happened there. His dad living that rough life. His mom just being a mom, holding James. And his dad came up and shot her in the leg.
Mm-hmm. Came out blasting. And definitely held quite the grudge against his dad growing up. Apparently his dad was also a former boxer. Almost a Bobby Boucher level of anger.
Easily.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then his dad went away for a bunch of years, I think, for rape or something. So he's been in jail forever. And so he grew up in a rough life. You know what I mean? Like, just the start of it, you can see that he had a rough upbringing. And then coming up in Detroit, I imagine it was pretty rough. So...
Well, his mom was quite the badass, though.
That's
from
true.
What I found out, she ended up opening up her own, basically bakery called Specialty Cakes and Pies in 1981. She went back to school to try and help provide a better life for James, and James really didn't get into boxing at the beginning of his life. Football was his sport. You want to talk to us about that, Elias, and a famous event that happened?
Yeah, played football in high school, quarterback, and ended up going to, I believe it was Michigan State. And it wasn't even during the season, gets into an altercation with a young Deion Sanders over a bunk bed in which James knocks out Deion. According to James, Deion, of course, has never commented on this event.
Not a big prime time moment.
No, but he fucked around and found out pretty much. So
Me hitting him hitting the floor. But he sustained an injury, though, an ankle injury, where the doctors had said that this could be, it'll end your career and could be, something that'll linger for the rest of your life if you keep playing football. So he found the boxing gym. Do you want to talk about where he trained and everything about his amateur career?
Yeah, ended up in the Kronk gym in Detroit.
Yep.
Under Bill Miller, who was one of the lead trainers at Kronk. Didn't have much of an amateur career, just really short amateur run, and then went straight to the pros. Took a little time to get built up, but Bill really introduced him to a lot of older fighters like Ezzard Charles, which James kind of modeled himself after, and just really a throwback style that James had and cultivated pretty quickly. Kind of picked up boxing like a savant.
Yeah.
Well, something that I thought was kind of interesting because he came in pretty much as a clean slate. So Bill pretty much looked at him and was just like, well, you're completely athletic. You're a top, high school and college football player. And now I can pretty much make you into the fighter that I want. And you really see that with the shoulder roll, which I thought was so ridiculous when you watch him essentially just dodge like 50 punches in a row. But yeah, that's the way I got it. Was Bill was just like, oh, I can make this guy to be the boxer I want.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, as an amateur, 33 wins, 2 knockouts, 2 losses. This is where he was nicknamed Lights Out by Gregory Owens, actually. This is where he earned his nickname for, knocking people's lights out.
As he would do a lot of over the course of his career.
Yeah, definitely. Getting into his professional career by March of 1991, he had won his first 25 fights. That's what's so amazing.
Which we're talking about like a span of 2 years.
Yeah. Because as we were talking about before the podcast, he loves to fight. That's what he was put on this earth to do.
Fight and eat.
Yeah.
And in equal measure. And yeah, I don't think there's anything that makes him happier. Training, not so much. Not a big fan of the running.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was even back then, even when he was like an amateur, he never did any cardio or anything like that. The only thing he ever did was spar, and he would spar all day. And that's what they were saying was he would literally spar against all types of, like, whoever wanted to spar, he would bring him. It was like the mountain in Game of Thrones where he was just like slaying people. They're just like, oh, God.
James is back. But as far as his manager, though, he had quite an interesting route for that because his first manager was shot 19 times and murdered. But his second manager was a lady.
And a weird, in the boxing world,
Yeah.
she seemed out of, you know.
Which I think speaks to James's paranoia that would show itself over his career.
Totally.
That, he had plenty of options, but went with the completely unknown, untested Jackie Callan. I mean, he could have went with Don King or Top Rank, and instead just random Jewish lady, and he would put a Star of David on his trunks in appreciation for her.
She, I think, was in entertainment management, I
believe
think,
so.
as outside of sports. So he was one of the first sports clients that she had. By March of 91, as I had said, he was 25-0, and then his only draw was against the guy that he fought with chicken pox. So, and then beat him again, Sanderline Williams, I believe. Promoter Barb Aram wanted him to fight Michael Nunn, $50,000, $15,000 in expenses, and $1 million for his next 3 fights if he ended up beating Nunn, because James is chomping at the bit. His biggest purse to that point was $12,000. And James's quote, which is just typical James Toney, "Take the fight. I will beat that son of a bitch."
Yeah, he talks so much shit. I love it so much. And this is like, he doesn't really change who he is. Like the fame, the money, he literally is the same guy from when I bet he started boxing, which is so awesome.
I mean, if you look up James Toney shit talking on YouTube, you're going to go through multiple pages.
I was going to say, there's almost more highlights of that than of him actually boxing.
That's his sizzle reel in addition to the
Yeah.
boxing.
Yeah, which I always rooted for a Mike Tyson James Toney fight just for the shit talking, but sadly it never came to pass.
That's so sad, honestly.
The press conferences alone.
Yeah.
So he was a 20-1 underdog against Nunn in that particular fight, May 10th, 1991 in Davenport, Iowa, which was Michael Nunn's hometown of all. And it was for the IBF middleweight belt. And this is a pretty interesting fight. You want to get into it, Elias?
Yeah, at the time, Nunn was pretty widely considered, if not number 1, number 2, pound for pound. Well-established middleweight champion. James was kind of an unknown coming into the fight. And it was a fairly even fight through most of it, with Nunn having an edge, going into the later rounds. But as James would kind of show throughout his career, he had despite the bad training habits, he had a gas tank. He could, go into the late rounds and, Nunn let his guard down, and that's really all it took.
Yeah, caught him with a right uppercut, and that just kind of dazed him, got back up, and then Toney basically just finished the job and finished him off. Quite a big upset for the time, I should say.
Well, I mean, he was 20-1 betting, so nobody thought he was going to come in and do this. And like you said, Nunn was like the guy that everybody was looking at as like the pound-for-pound guy.
I mean, his nickname was second to none. I mean,
well, he was certainly second to none on that day.
Indeed.
The Ring Magazine named him Fighter of the Year, and his next 7 fights, he retained the middleweight title, although there were a couple in between that were some close calls for him.
Yeah, notably, are we to Dave Tiberi?
Yeah.
Which would, that was, for anyone who's watched the Tiberi fight, most of James's losses are debatable. That one is not. Basically got dominated by a fairly unknown Dave Tiberi, who history is trying to kind of made him out to be less than he was. He was Bernard Hopkins' primary sparring partner for a number of years.
Oh, wow.
Pretty well respected in the Philadelphia area. And he just muscled a very weight-drained James the entire fight. Just outworked him, out-hustled him. ends up somehow getting robbed of the decision, which leads to some congressional hearings.
Yeah, the senator from Delaware was talking all sorts of shit about looking into boxing.
Just looking into the corruption because it was so blatant, and that's what they were saying was like we really need this obvious where it's so obvious that he lost this fight. Why is it going to a split decision where he loses? So it's
well, and thankfully, due to those hearings, they really cleaned up the sport, and there were no more bad decisions ever again.
that's right.
Yeah, never
I don't think
again.
I've heard of one. Not in my
it's
lifetime. I mean,
completely-
Yeah, no, thank God for that.
The Robin Williams. You're telling me the Oscars aren't political? Oh shit. So keeps fighting at the middleweight, but then ends up on February 13th, 1993, fought Iran Barkley to win the IBF super middleweight title, which
This is peak James.
Yeah.
Like there are few fights I would just say is a perfect performance. The Iran Barkley fight is absolute the best James ever looked. Just it completely dominated start to finish. Iran was just tailor-made. He's just going to walk straight forward, and James was able to eat him up, just slip and hit him with uppercuts pretty much at will the entire fight, which I believe that one was pretty much an even money fight going into it. Because Iran Barkley had just beaten Roberto Duran, I want to say, or I might be a little fuzzy on the timeline there.
yeah.
But Iran was fairly well respected, even though he was kind of a bit of a clumsy, straightforward fighter. But
That just walks into James's strengths, though.
Yeah.
oh yeah, and he just got chopped up. He was, his lips were all ripped up and cut. They had to stop it due to cuts, I believe, in the 8th. And James would never look better. I believe he follows that up with the Prince Charles Williams
Yeah.
fight, which was another kind of classic performance where he stopped Charles Williams in the 12th round with, I believe, 30 seconds left.
Yeah.
Which, again, another example of James really carrying that power late into fights.
Well, that's what he talked about, especially during the Nunn fight, too. They were like, hey, man, you're losing this fight. He's like, no, he's getting tired, and I'm going to catch him with something, basically.
I mean, I've one of the things that always made me appreciate James, there's a lot of confident athletes out there. I've never seen anyone more, and honestly confident, not false bravado. James believed in James
Oh, yeah.
100%.
Which is why a fight that's coming up in 1994 in Las Vegas is something that kind of throws a wrench in that confidence because he never thought it could even happen.
No, but when you come into training camp at 220, when you fight at 168, that's you're kind of pizza when you should have French fried.
He's going to have a bad time.
And indeed, James would have a bad time against Roy Jones, which most people did, in fairness.
Yeah, he was a great fighter.
But that fight, if you watch it, he really gets like outclassed the whole time. It's like almost like two different fighters because he really gets into his head and like it's all of it where you're like, oh, he's not even like in this fight.
No, I mean I could argue it's like 11 rounds to 1 or maybe even a complete shutout, 12 rounds to none. And it was a pretty shocking result because that was a mega fight when it was made.
The Uncivil War is what they called it, yep.
And again, plenty of shit talking leading up to it, which is also fun.
Oh, it's the best.
But no, James was completely outclassed. And I don't think psychologically he recovered for quite a while after that. It was a lot for him to take. You can see it when the decision is announced. He tries to act surprised, but you can see that, he knew what had happened. And not much shame in losing to a prime Roy Jones, and you can argue it's Roy Jones' signature win.
Yeah.
If you go through Roy's career, I'd have a hard time saying there's a more notable win on his resume, but he did not see the best James Toney that day.
No, it's the only fight where he had a standing 8 count, and only Reggie Johnson had ever done that in 46 fights leading up to it. So, I mean, he definitely got his ass beat that night, unfortunately for him. But the next fight is against Montel Griffin, and this is an interesting one. You sent us the HBO kind of intro for that fight. You want to get into it?
Yeah, Montel was 14-0. This was seen as a nice rebound fight for James. It did not tend to go that way.
No.
Now, me personally, I scored the fight for James 8 rounds to 4, but it was a problem that would rear its head a lot through James's career that he really only fought one way. It was a lot of counterpunching against the ropes, let the other guy do his thing, and that didn't always play well with judges, so he ends up losing a close decision, probably not a dirty decision. I don't believe it. If the promoters wanted anyone to win, they would have wanted James so they could get the lucrative Roy Jones rematch, but unfortunately, James came up short in that one. And Montel Griffin wasn't a bad fighter. He's very awkward and, high energy, but clearly he didn't have the same punching power. James hurt him at a couple of points in the fight, but just a kind of a listless performance. It was not James' best performance by a long shot.
Well, and going into the fight, too, it was his last one for the contract as far as Jackie Cowan.
Yeah, and that's the lead-in on that. There was a lot of turmoil in his camp, understandably, because this was only 3 months after the Roy Jones fight. So I don't think psychologically in any way he had recovered from that, kind of shellacking he had gotten from Jones. So, going into it, Jackie Cowan used to be in his corner during fights. He made her sit at ringside. She couldn't be cornering him anymore. There were some accusations that Jackie Cowan had wanted him to go on daytime talk shows and use the excuse of he had an eating disorder, which is why he lost to Roy Jones, which also pissed off James because, say what you will, man, about him. He was not an excuse maker for the most part, except for in the aftermath. Then it started to be blaming everyone. It was, Jackie, it was Bill Miller, it was, whatever the case may be. But that was the end of his partnership with Jackie Cowan in the aftermath of Montel Griffin.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and you could tell from him in that interview before the fight that he was just like almost dazed that he actually lost to Roy Jones.
Oh, he was still processing it. For
Yeah.
Sure.
Because I feel like it wasn't even just a loss; it was being dominated.
Yeah,
Because he
it was
wasn't
more
in the
so that.
yeah, it was he wasn't in the fight, and I bet he had never experienced that in his life, where he was just so dominated and he was making fun of him too. So I bet it was pissing him off, and it was all of it,
And I mean, especially I think the chicken move knockdown that
Yep.
Roy
Yep.
pulled on him. I think that especially having this moment that people laughed at. James strikes me as somebody who does not like being laughed at, and it was pretty rough times for him for quite a few years.
Do you think that super middle was his best weight class?
I would argue yes, although I think his career would have went better if he skipped 175 altogether and went straight to cruiserweight.
Yeah.
After the Montel Griffin fight, he should have said, look, I'm naturally at least 190. Let me go up there. I think he would have done a lot better.
Because he was 205 like when he was playing high school football. So I mean, like that's a lot of weight to lose to retain muscle mass and power. I
sure.
would at least think.
Especially when you don't do cardio.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy.
Speed is the name of the game, Mac. But so after the Griffin loss in February '95, he wins his next 9 in a row at light heavyweight and cruiserweight. And then he has a rematch against Griffin in that December of '96, I believe.
Which another of the notable things about James is I believe he had 11 fights in between the year and a half that he loses to Griffin and then fights him a year and a half later, and had 10 or 11 fights in that span.
God.
Just keeping himself busy, which, modern day fighters of James's level, they're fighting twice a year at most, maybe 3 in the rare instance. So you would have thought, okay, he's prepared, he's kept himself in shape. Fight plays out almost identically to the first one, and it's interesting in that Montel Griffin is kind of the common link between Jones and Toney, in that he fought James Toney twice, wins 2 close decisions, fights Roy Jones, wins by DQ in the first, and in the second one, Roy Jones says, just screw it, I'm gonna square up, I'm gonna knock this guy out, because Montel was not a big puncher. And so Roy just walked through him in the second fight, which is how James should have approached it.
Yep.
He should have known this guy can't hurt me. I'm just going to get him out of there.
Well, and the interesting thing about James is he had a very strong chin.
You can say that. I mean, 90 pro fights, never knocked out.
That's ridiculous.
Maybe the most he was hurt was probably the Reggie Johnson knockdown.
Yeah.
Or very late in his career against Sam Peter. But for the most part, unshakable.
Oh, definitely. After that, in February of '97, he beats Mike McCallum for the, I believe, the cruiserweight title, and then loses to Drake Thadsey for the vacant IBO light heavyweight title.
Other than Roy Jones, that may be the other biggest black mark on James, in that Thadsey was a journeyman at best. I believe he was 28-8 coming into that.
Oh, geez.
James comes in overweight, loses his title on the scales, and another kind of listless ho-hum performance. And Thadsey, this time I actually scored it for Thadsey. It's one of the few that I scored against James. Like his his career, I would say he has 4 decision losses that I can argue against. I can't really argue the Thad one. He just came in out of shape, didn't seem to care, and it showed.
Well, what was the story you were telling about the cookies?
Oh, yeah, there was I forget the boxing writer who had seen him in the lobby of the hotel before the fight. It was the night before the fight. And he somehow sees James Toney with a plate loaded with cookies running back to his room, which, it just is the quintessential James Toney story. And it's like, is this guy taking it seriously? And
he almost feels like a kid sometimes, where he can't be controlled. He blames everybody. He eats too much, and
well, when your dad steals your childhood.
But like you were saying, he has all of these fights one after another, not because he necessarily has to have all these fights, but they were trying to keep him in shape because that they knew that having a fight coming up would keep him in shape, which is kind of crazy to think of a fighter at this level kind of being such a immature guy.
Well, you guys had covered Riddick Bowe and, had lots of laughs at the kitchen in the bedroom and, his eating habits, which eventually destroyed his career. But James showed the best way to manage that. If you can't get him to quit eating, keep him fighting.
Yeah,
seriously,
that's
though,
his only form of conditioning. That's kind of what I thought through researching this.
Because he does get a little fatter later, but he always is completely in shape.
A little fatter.
Well, I'm just saying. But like you were saying, he can always go into these late rounds. That's the thing that I have to give it up to him.
Even at his fattest.
I know. It's crazy. He'll go 12.
There's a garbage bag of chimichangas somewhere, Mac.
James cultivated much mass.
Yes, he did. So after the Thad fight, he beat Steve Little in June of 1997. Yeah. And doesn't fight until 1999, actually. He takes a little bit of a hiatus.
I think it was time to hit reset. The Thad fight was kind of the writing on the wall of what the hell are you doing? Losing to Montel Griffin, even in highly debatable fights, which, again, I thought he won both of them, that you can understand. There was no explaining that. That was a little much. And so, he takes this hiatus, and then we get to really kind of the third career of James.
Yeah, a little bit of a renaissance here, I believe.
To me, pre-Roy Jones, when he's a superstar, that's the first career, and then there's kind of the dark days there in the middle. Once he goes to cruiserweight, finally seems like he is at an optimal weight for him. Doesn't seem drained. Knowing that he squandered a lot of time, seems motivated, and works his way up to a title shot against Vasily Jirov.
Yeah, for the IBF cruiserweight. Yeah,
which my probably favorite fight of James's career. A fun little thing about Jirov, he was a Soviet bloc fighter. Forget the actual country. I want to say Kazakhstan.
Yeah, I think it was Kazakhstan. Yeah.
He was trained by just kind of it was a rough methods used to train him. At one point, he was put in a hallway, and they sicked 2 Dobermans on him
to make him run.
That was part of his training.
Jesus.
So he was a pretty tough customer when he got in there with James, and just a nip and tuck fight. If you have not seen any James Toney fights of note, the Jirov fight I would highly recommend. Entertaining throughout. And really
goes 12 rounds, yeah.
12 rounds with a highly dramatic and fun finish.
Oh, yes.
Well, they were saying because the volume that both of these guys throw is more than anybody else, and that's why it was such a great fight, because it was constant action.
Jirov was, generally threw 100 punches around, very high volume. It was just kind of the perfect matchup where you've got this super high volume guy against, just a great counter puncher who's going to use that against him. And for most of the fight, it looked like maybe it was not going to go James's way, because as much as he was countering, Jirov was landing a lot of shots throughout that fight. But as always, James still had that gas going into the 11th and 12th. And going into the 12th, Freddie Roach tells him, you need to put this guy on his ass. And, James, in typical James fashion, all right, fucker, goes out there and does exactly that. Puts Jirov on his ass in the last minute of the 12th and gets the decision. Which makes him Ring Fighter of the Year, I believe it 10 years apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And became a 3-weight world champion and comeback of the year, too, which is just fantastic for him to, get over that Jones and Griffin kind of.
It really was kind of like letting people know James was a special talent the entire time. He may have kind of went off track for a good decade there, but he is a unique talent in the history of boxing. There's not many counterpunchers of his ability.
Oh, not at all. His next fight, he moves up to heavyweight, though. And this is an interesting matchup.
This is Holyfield.
Yes,
correct?
it is. Ooh, some
now-
fun quotes here.
Well, I mean, Holyfield, this was not prime Holyfield,
No.
which I got to be fair on that level, but it was not remotely competitive in any way. It was James start to finish. Ends up basically stopping Holyfield with body shots, which the only other person to stop Evander was Riddick Bowe, which is a very large heavyweight. So people did not expect James to knock out Evander Holyfield. And I did coming into it. I was full on believer. That was,
Really? No way.
No, I was after the Jirov fight. I was high on the James Toney Kool-Aid. So I was like, let's see him fight the Klitschko's. Let's see him fight Mike Tyson. Let's do it. Because I mean, James, called out everybody. He wanted to fight Lennox Lewis. He wanted to fight Mike Tyson. He wanted to fight the Klitschko's. Most of those probably would not have gone well. I believe the 6'7" and 6'8" Klitschko brothers probably would have been
to a 5'9" guy like Tony. That's just too much reach.
Yeah. But the bottom line, James would have taken those fights without hesitation.
Nice.
But instead, he fights Holyfield. Very impressive win, knocks him out in the 8th, and I believe follows that up with Ruiz. Who, again, the ties with Roy Jones kind of continue all through his career.
They were trying to set up a Jones fight after this. Did you see that,
idea.
Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which Roy Jones really didn't seem all that interested in.
No.
Especially heavyweight, right?
Yes.
That's what he didn't want because he wanted it to be obviously at the weight that he beat him at.
Or close to it.
Meet in the middle somewhere, yeah.
But, where he would not have had the massive speed advantage at heavyweight, I just don't think he was. And at that point, how much money did James really bring to the table versus Roy taking easier fights? Which, although Roy's career would nosedive right after, because instead of James Toney, he opted to go Antonio Tarver, which began the steep descent of Roy Jones's career. But so Roy Jones had beaten John Ruiz fairly soon, or fairly close before the time James fought him. James fights him, dominates the fight, but then in a recurring issue that would continue until the end of his career, test positive for nandrolone.
Yeah, he had during the fight with Rydell Booker. After that, he basically hurt his arm, and what ends up happening after the Ruiz fight, because the Booker one was before the Ruiz fight, and after beating Ruiz, then piss is hot.
And he said that he got it from a doctor because of his arm, and they were just like, no, it's obvious that you've been just roiding up. And then you're right, he gets popped a couple more times, which makes it even more obvious. So it was like, it wasn't just like an injury. He saw this that was like, oh, I'm older and I kind of need this.
And I'm a big proponent of. I mean, if you're late 30s or above in boxing, I think we just need to be fair about it. Yeah, it takes some HGH.
I'd say it should be mandatory.
I mean, the guy went up from 160 to he's fighting at like 230, 240 toward the end there. Yeah, let the guy do a little bit of roids. I mean,
5'9", 240, oh my God, I can't even believe it. But yeah, they changed the fight from a win to a no contest, the New York Athletic Commission. And then we get into the Dominic Quinn fight, which was funny in 2006, just for one of the moments during it. Because James had done it a lot before, you had said.
At the time, Quinn was already kind of being seen as an afterthought. At one time, Quinn was actually a hot heavyweight prospect, but I don't know, just kind of a listless guy. Didn't seem to have a lot of passion for it. So, he's kind of James's comeback fight. Really, the only reason the fight is notable is James Toney spends the majority of the fight talking shit to another fighter who's in the crowd.
So, when this is so great because when they tie up, he'll literally just go to the crowd and just start talking shit. I love it so much.
Fuck you, Chris Bird.
Yep, it's like the Simpsons episode with Drederick Tatum talking to Charlie Sheen. Yes, so what I got at the sea bath, and then.
Which, I mean, if you're going to have a fairly lame fight, at least make it entertaining, which James had a good habit of doing.
He's like the greatest showman, only not, in a circus. But next fight, draw against Hasim Rahman for the WBC heavyweight title.
Another fight that I did not agree with the scoring. I thought James did enough to win it, albeit very close. Hasim Rahman was in great shape for that fight, which this is another of my favorite James Toney memories is in the opening, whenever they show the initial graphic that shows the age and weight and reach of the fighters, Jim Lampley gives a very nice introduction. It says that Hasim Rahman is coming in at a very chiseled 235 pounds, and James Toney at 232 is a fat tub of goo. And that fat tub of goo went on to, in my opinion, win that fight.
Yep.
I felt like Jim Lampley omitted and a tough SOB, which,
But see, that's the thing, and you had talked about it before too. He's not scheduling lesser fighters. He will just fight anyone at all times possible, and like it's the Ric Flair mentality. You want to be the best, you got to beat the best. Like,
well, James would not shy away from. I do not care who it is. I mean, if you had a time machine and got a prime Muhammad Ali, he'd be like, fine, do it. Let's do it tonight.
Pick a weight. Let's go.
Like, I don't need preparation. I don't need a training camp. Let's go.
I need a plate full of cookies.
That's right.
I mean, the man ran on cookies.
That's right.
But I mean, the major criticism about his style and all of that was that he had all these split decisions that it wasn't necessarily obvious that he won because he was so defensive.
And it was, as good as he was in the ring and as talented as he was at counterpunching, there wasn't a lot of versatility to his style where, in certain fights he would have been better served to fight a more aggressive style because that defensive Philly shell style, it worked. There was nobody who ever, outside of Roy Jones, that really dominated him. But it wasn't necessarily friendly to a judge scoring the fight who might see you as having less activity, and they just score it on activity and what they consider to be ring generalship. Because you're on the ropes, they think that you don't want to be there.
Well, you were talking about before, there's no advanced camera angles or just watching it on TV and seeing it for what it is.
No, and I mean, it just kind of highlights one of the bigger problems with boxing is just, having judges sitting on one side of the ring without the advantage of TV angles. Are they really seeing the best representation of the fight? And I think in a lot of instances they're not. But it was a routine problem with James where he couldn't. Now, against the heavyweights like Hasim Rahman, I understand not being more aggressive. Hasim Rahman's a very large fellow, former heavyweight champion of the world, hits hard. Maybe not him, but the Montel Griffins, and Drake Dadsons of the world.
When you're in cruiserweight and super middleweight, that kind of area,
be a little more aggressive.
Definitely. So he has the next two fights are both against Samuel Peter, and those are a couple of good ones.
This is the end of the prime.
Yeah.
The first Sam Peter fight, at least an entertaining fight. Another one, I thought James did enough to edge it. 7 rounds to 5. I thought he did enough, but they give the decision to Peter. Then they go into an immediate rematch, and this is the end of peak James Toney, or at least competitive James Toney. So Sam Peter, very large Nigerian heavyweight, just a bulky man, and was able to just bully James for the most part. One of the other few times I'd seen James legitimately hurt in a fight, where I believe it was maybe the second or third round, Sam Peter hits him with a right hand that had James grabbing the ropes and trying to stay up. But, I mean, he is fighting giant people, and he is not a giant man himself.
No, and that's what I found so incredible, because how many guys fighting at the heavyweight division are 5'9"? It can't be that many, right?
No, I mean, he would be among the shortest ever. I mean, even Mike Tyson was like 5'10" and a half, 5'11".
Yeah.
And he's one of the shorter in recent memory. I honestly can't think of any other. Like Joe Frazier was 6 foot.
Yeah. But I mean, to put on that type of weight, you need a taller frame at least to, make it work, I would think.
James showed you didn't really.
No,
need
you
it.
didn't, because when you're a fat tub of goose,
That's
sometimes
right.
you can just.
Yeah, that was one badass fat tub of goo.
Hell yeah.
Again, I mean, that Lampley quote is so gold.
Oh, it's great.
One of the best laugh I ever had in a boxing match, I believe.
Is it really nice?
Because it was unexpected. It's like, really? You called the man a fat tub of goo.
I wonder what James had to say after that, if he ever heard it. Did he confront him?
Well, I mean, you probably wouldn't have understood it. Like, one of my favorite things about James was the post-fight interviews.
Oh man, like
which
the
we have skipped
Holyfield
over
one.
a little. The Holyfield one.
Yeah,
Yes.
let's do
Gray.
that.
Yeah, Jim Gray comes up to interview him, which he had been interviewed by Jim Gray before, and it went relatively well. For whatever reason, James was in a bad mood on this one, so Jim's asking him fairly normal questions of, do you think your speed was too much for Holyfield? And he's like, my speed too much for anybody. And I believe James said, I ain't going to answer none of your badass questions. Don't know what that meant. Anyways, Jim Gray goes to ask him something else. James slaps the mic out of his hands, like, I don't even like you. Walks off.
What are some of the other ones that you like, though? Like some of your other favorites?
After the Vasily
Tony
Giroff
fan.
fight, when he was being interviewed by Jim Lampley, and he was totally not paying attention to Jim Lampley the entire time. Like James is he's talking to people in the crowd, not paying attention. Jim finally gets his attention, and James like, well, first, I want to thank Billy Blanks and Pastor Boo Boo. And I got milk, baby.
That was it.
It's like what? When he was interviewed by Larry Merchant, I want to say it was like after Prince Charles Williams. He's like, I'm going to Burger King, baby, Burger King. He was always just fun in those post-fight interviews.
How did Burger King not parlay that into some sort of awesome marketing campaign?
Seriously.
He deserved it.
Oh, God.
King of the Ring, come on.
You're a title holder. What are you doing next? I'm going to Burger King, baby. Burger King.
James was he was quite the personality. I'll say on the second Sam Peter fight, that was just sad for me. I watched it live, and
was that just the end though for him? Then?
Yeah, I kind of had boo boo face on that one. That was just like, oh. I knew it was a bad matchup. Actually, I had met Teddy Atlas fairly soon before the first Sam Peter fight.
Oh, cool.
I was at like a Friday night fights in Tulsa, and end up sneaking over the barricade because they were like done with filming. All the cameramen were packing up, and Teddy was still there. And Teddy, super nice guy. Ended up like talking to him for like 20 minutes, primarily about the James Toney Sam Peter fight, which he thought Sam Peter was going to dominate. So I was right, Teddy Atlas, for the record. But his Teddy's prediction would come true for the second fight.
Yeah, just out and out kind of.
You can only go against conventional logic for so long, where eventually, as the older, littler man, the ring wars are going to catch up, especially with all the sparring that James did, which we had talked about. That was essentially James's method of staying in shape. Besides, like a busy schedule, was just all he did was spar. And as you hear James talk today, it kind of shows.
Yep. That's what people are saying with the excessive sparring, because it's constant brain damage, essentially, or constant, you know what I mean? Like, you don't even get your skull or anything chance to heal. And, if you watch an interview now, he is unintelligible, so.
And, James didn't do light sparring.
No.
He fought ring wars, where there are plenty of stories about, people coming into the gym. Danny Green was not sure if he was light heavyweight or cruiserweight at the time, but basically just comes in looking to do some work with James, and James is never going to turn down a fight, so they get in there and get into sparring. There's video of it online, and James gets the better of it, but at the same time, Danny was landing some pretty big shots, enough to the point it pissed off James enough to go to his locker and get a gun and had to be restrained. Because, that's what you do.
Of course it is. Like in The Replacements, just, I'll be right back.
Yep.
It's pretty much my understanding of how it went.
He went and got a Mac 10.
And, so Danny leaves the gym that day, but, good video online over that one. James did have a propensity towards pulling guns on people. Jackie Callan being another one. We kind of omitted that. At some point thought she was stealing his money, so, I don't know if that was in the crappy Meg Ryan Against the Ropes movie I boycotted as a James Toney fan.
Well, he boycotted it too. He wanted no part of it.
Yeah.
Omar Epps plays an anonymous boxer who he plays not James Toney.
He plays Tony James, which,
Jonah Hill played the other person because Paul DePodesta didn't want to be a part of it.
I mean, if there is any sacrilege to James's career, it's that a movie got made about Jackie Callan.
Oh, God. You're right, though. It's true.
In what world is that right?
It's so stupid.
But the James Toney story in general should be a movie.
There's certainly material you could craft a narrative around. But
oh, my gosh. Just the growing up basically watching your mom struggle and going through everything. He had talked about how
Slapping Neon Dion.
how one of his friends when he was 18, they caught his friend with drugs, and his mom just basically like explained to him, it's prison rehab or the tombstone. You're an 18-year-old black kid. Don't fuck this up.
And to James's credit, made the right decision, got out of the dealing, and
Yeah, because he was dealing crack in high school when he was on the football team.
Yep.
He said it was peer pressure.
Or, money in your pocket pressure, either one. And I can't fault him for
No,
it.
fuck no.
I certainly fault him more for his sweet tooth than anything.
Yeah, right. But his mom's a baker.
Yep.
Like, how you going to escape that?
No, and especially with a fairly rough life coming up, and it's like, well, hey, when I have an apple pie, I'm happy. And I think that just kind of carried through James's entire life, which now at least, hey, he's fairly fat and happy.
Yeah. Because he kind of fought for the next
comeback.
few years after the Peter fights, but then we got into the UFC and that sideshow.
Yeah, and there's a bit of a sadness for me. I have a lot of friends that they knew at the time. As noted, I am a James Toney fanboy, so going into the UFC deal, I was actually excited about it. I'm like, no, James is going to take this seriously. James is going to train. And that was me arguing against the history of James's career, because James did not take it seriously and ends up against Randy Couture, which is quite unfair.
I was going to say, the best
veteran,
wrestler. Yeah.
Yeah, let's throw you in with a classic Olympic wrestler, one of the best fighters in the sport, and there's your debut. Had they put him in there with maybe Rampage Jackson, that would have been a more natural sell. The shit talking was certainly.
Oh, man, that would have been amazing.
But instead, no, James kind of got embarrassed. I actually went and saw it at the AMC, like when they were showing UFCs there.
Did you really?
Yeah, I walked out after. I was quite sad.
Because he was outclassed in wrestling. Like, that's just the only thing. It would have been great. Yeah, but it would have been great if he had another guy who was more of a stand-up. Like, that's what everybody wanted to see.
No, but James talked so much shit that he kind of put the UFC in an unfortunate position. They're like, okay, this guy is shitting on our entire sport, saying they're all garbage, and he's going to come in and he's going to show them who's boss. So they're like, oh, that's how it is. Okay. And so they put him in there with Couture, and just seeing James tap out was particularly sad to me.
Mm-hmm. He never did it in a boxing ring.
No, but, when you got somebody on top of you just pounding you in the dome, it's...
Yeah, somebody with decades worth of experience,
And I think James quickly realized, I'm not getting out of this position.
Yeah.
I can't shoulder roll out of an arm bar.
No, laying flat on your back, the shoulder roll is kind of nullified. So
there's no ropes to protect you.
it's tragic.
But yeah, any other James Toney memories that you have that kind of stick out that are really cool?
We've covered most of them. Just the knockout highlight reel is always great. Just to if you look up James Toney highlights, he certainly entertaining, and the shoulder roll was great. But where was I going to go with it? Just a consummate professional, and that he was a savant in that he did things no one else could really get away with. And the thing that gets me, coming from a football background, you would think that he would have better movement in the ring. And I was telling you that if I'm breaking down James and just rating him by attributes, the upper body movement, probably like a 9 out of 10. He was just super slick up top, but his feet, he's like a 3 out of 10. I mean, he did not like to move around the ring. He would get lazy and lay on the ropes where, really would have seen him try to do more with that. But all-time favorite James moments, probably the Iran Barkley fight, which is just amazing to watch. James getting off 20 punches in a row without anything coming back. He was phenomenal at 168. Trying to think other notable moments that we haven't covered. Sticking out the tongue on Holyfield was just
that was
amusing.
just mean.
And just he's left quite a legacy of, at least, again, if you're bored, look up James Toney shit talking on YouTube and just kind of go down the rabbit hole. There is a lot of content.
Well, I feel like he dominated at so many different weight classes that his style really he was one of the better pound-for-pound fighters in that era because you could see him going through all these weight classes. And like you said, his really only time getting dominated was, Roy Jones. And that was like,
Well,
except for later, but you know what I mean.
well, and there's other good fighters on the resume we didn't even really touch on, like Mike McCallum. Who,
the McCallum fight.
A fairly prime Mike McCallum, or at least just barely outside of his prime. Which they fought to a draw, and then they had a second fight where James got a narrow decision, which I thought he won both. But Mike McCallum was one of the great but lesser heralded 70s and 80s stars. The Body Snatcher, which is one of my favorite fighter nicknames.
Oh, my God.
Which was a worthy moniker for Mike McCallum. He was pretty destructive going low, but I mean, just 90 pro fights over
29 years.
29 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I really wish he would have maybe cut those last 5 years off of there.
Cut out the MMA.
Well, I mean, that was you get the paycheck. I understand it. And he did fight a bit after that. I believe it was after that he had the Hasim Rahman rematch, which which was another fight in which he tested positive for steroids. Got a third round stoppage by cut over Rahman, which I thought James was doing well in that one. Then he fights Freza Kendo, who was kind of like a middling contender at heavyweight. Gets a gift decision on that one. That was another one I thought James lost that one handily, but got a gift of a decision, and then just kind of I forget what's that. I think that's where we just get into fighting a few bums here and there.
Yeah,
well,
like he went to
he's
Britain. To fight in like a tournament type of series.
I think that was really the end where, I mean, when you're fighting against basically club level fighters in a 3-rounder and you can't win. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
time to hang him up, pretty much.
Yeah, and I mean, you could already. I mean, the slurring in his speech was pretty evident. I mean, even around the time of the Randy Couture fight, I mean, it was. I mean, you can listen to interviews of him in his prime at middleweight, where sounds clear as day. I mean, there's a clear progression where, you really wish there was a national sanctioning body to be like, we think maybe it's time to.
He's talking like Rocky and Rocky 5, essentially.
Well, that's one of the big shames about boxing is the lack of a central organizing body where, there should be some kind of pension plan where basically Social Security for boxers where, we're putting away a percentage of the purse just because we, at some point we're going to say, enough's enough, guy.
Yeah.
Time to go home. Here's a little bit of money to, keep you going. But
they treat him worse than the NFL does, which is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue. I mean, boxing is still kind of the outlaw sport that it started as. Where, I mean, back in the old days when it was on, barges off the
Jack
coast
Dempsey,
of New York.
Yeah.
It hasn't evolved much.
No, well, I mean, it's still the same thing. Knock the other guy down, knock him out, and
which is what I love about it. Yeah, its beauty is in its simplicity.
Definitely. Well, we appreciate you coming on with us, Elias, and discussing James Toney today. Chris, anything to add?
No, just thank you to Elias. And really, it was fun researching James Toney and watching all these highlights because, it was great. So thank you all for tuning in.